Marshall here. Welcome back to the YouTube version of the Realignment podcast. I've got an excellent guest today. Geopolitics expert and author Tim Marshall is making a return appearance on the show. We're discussing everything to do with the idea of astropolitics, looking what happens when geopolitical competition on Earth enters into the space arena. This, of course, is defined by many folks as the new space race. So we're discussing China, Russia, the United States, and of course, Elon Musk. Hope you all enjoy this conversation, and I'd definitely love to hear what you think in the comments below. Tim Marshall, welcome back to the Realignment.
Oh, it's great to be invited again. Thanks. And, people with Marshall in their name, we have to stick together.
There's actually another Marshall who's going to be on the show the week before your episode comes out. But of course, it's a last name, not a first name. So I'm part of the unique end of that category. Let's start here before we get into the current book. I last had you on basically 2 years to the day almost. 2021, The Power of Geography came out. A lot has happened in the past 2 years on 15 different levels. I'd love for you just to kind of start there. What would listeners who followed your work, what would you just have to add to take us in?
Wow. Okay, the last 2 years.
That fits into the frame of your work on geography, obviously.
Yeah. But I think there's been a drift towards what I've been arguing for a few years, that I think this multipolar world we're in, and one of the reasons things are so confusing is because it's a multipolar world, but I keep seeing signs that we are drifting slowly back to a form of bipolar world, by which I mean the USA and China. So obviously it'll be different to the previous bipolar world. It's a form of Cold War that's coming again, different to the previous one. But all the time, I see things that are heading in that direction. I'll give you one example. I could give you lots. The Philippines and its agreement with the United States for extra basing rights and naval visits. This just tells you that more and more countries are looking at the future and realizing there's going to be a form of bipolar world, and which camp are we going to lean towards? And the Philippines has clearly decided it's going to lean towards the United States. So that's one example of many, many things that have happened over the last 2 years, which have reinforce my guess, and that's what it is, that's where we're heading.
That is the perfect pivot into something I'm really interested in. We're going to do your book in no particular order. You mentioned the Navy, you mentioned the ocean there. And my biggest beef with the Space Force in the United States is that if you actually look at the officer ranks, they are the equivalent of the Air Force's ranks. They're not the equivalent of the Navy's ranks. So for example, in science fiction, think of Star Wars. It's the Imperial Navy. Like that's the specific construct, because the point is in Star Wars, and actually this is true in Star Trek as well, the space is thought of as akin to the ocean, versus this isn't just like the air, like the Air Force. That seems like a niche thing, but it gets at what you're writing in the book about astropolitics. Yeah. How should we conceive of space?
I think that's a really good observation, because it is conceptual, and we have to look at this both conceptually and, of course, the sort of very practical level. There are two schools of thought about whether we think in terms of Air Force or Navy, and I come down on Navy. Only just, though. There is a shoreline, and it is the Earth's atmosphere. And then beyond that, you're out into the great ocean. But we're going to need coaling stations as we used to. You're going to have to dock and get into your coaling station. Whether that's going to be a new form of International Space Station, which the Americans under Artemis are going to try and build, or whether it's the moon. And you go further out from there, and we're getting further on in time, so it's harder to make predictions. But again, geographically and the concept of space having a geography, I think, is really important. There are areas you want, specifically at the moment: low Earth orbit for satellites, geosynchronous orbit for spy satellites, because that turns at the same speed, as the Earth turns. So you're looking at the same piece of territory all the time. Very useful territory to have. The moon, well, you want the South Pole. That's where the water is. And if there's water there, there's hydrogen there, and there's oxygen there, and there's also titanium and metals. So, you want that part of the moon. Geographically, it helps to launch your rockets from as close to the equator as possible, because you get the best slingshot effect. So there's a whole bunch of geography that goes into understanding astropolitics and why some things are more important or more sought after than others. So, yeah, I think conceptually it is useful to make your mind up whether you think in terms of Air Force or Navy, but certainly get across the geography of it.
So you just gave the bull case for conceiving of space and astropolitics as the ocean. What's the negative side of it? What are the conceptual limitations of thinking of space and the various challenges we and other countries are going to face, thinking of it as the ocean? Because there's a limit to everything. There's 3 dimensions. Well, two. What are the limits?
It's not this. I mean, it's not the same, is it? But I think we need concepts and sometimes buzzwords and phrases that we understand. Another example is when I talk about Cold War 2.0. Of course, it won't be like the previous Cold War. I mean, for example, China is completely embedded in the world economy in the way the Russian economy wasn't, and so you have to deal with it differently. But I think conceptually, to call it the potential coming new Cold War is a useful starting point to then understand the differences and complexities of what it will be. Because if, we don't have yet a new phrase that immediately, as soon as you say it, you're there in your head, which is why I do think it's useful to, vaguely think in terms of space as being the oceans and the vast distances and the challenges you have and the coaling stations and all that. But yeah, the negative side is the limitations of that. The limitations of thinking about it in any way that we have here on Earth, because we're dealing with infinity, basically.
Something I'm curious about, in that previous answer, you reference we're going to need coaling stations as we move outwards. What is our actual final objective here? Because this isn't an issue in the age of exploration, because there's a finite Earth. So you at the end of the day, you're going to make it to the Philippines. You're going to make it to India. There is an actual limit. What in this case are we moving out towards?
Well, this is one of the great concepts which make it almost becomes mystic. I mean, I think our relationship with the cosmos is also almost on a mystical level, and it's precisely because, especially now, we know that there is such a thing as infinity. So therefore, Marshall, there is no limit. No, that's not particularly useful in practical terms, but it's useful in getting across our imagination that it's out there. And we have never stopped. We've never not thought, I wonder what's across that body of water. I wonder what is at the top of that mountain. And so we will never stop, because to explore is to be human. So that is almost the end game, to continue to explore. But that's a sort of airy-fairy level. If you're talking at a practical level, in the short term, the goals are profits from commerce. The satellite industry is set to, I think it's triple by the end of the decade how much it's worth. There's already 80 countries in space, and a lot more are going there. It's scientific. There are so many things that we wouldn't have or wouldn't have done if it wasn't for the space travel and space experiments, especially on the medical side. We would never have managed to deflect an asteroid as we did last year, in order to prove that we can do such a thing if we really need to. And then the third aspect after science and commerce is, of course, military. This is a whole new front for the military. You mentioned Space Force. China's, I think, had the first. America, I think it was the second. India's got one. The UK has one. France, Germany, I think Italy. This is the coming area of not of combat, but of military activity, which is enmeshed in the military activity which happens down on Earth. So much of it, so much of a modern war cannot be fought without assets in space. And Ukraine-Russia has partially proven that.
Why do you say not combat? Because obviously we're not talking X-Wings versus TIE fighters from Star Wars. That actually doesn't, because, and this is actually kind of depressing if you're a sci-fi lover like myself, like X-Wings versus TIE fighters, or George Lucas taking it's him taking World War II films and basically setting them in space. Like that's the conceptual thing. Space combat on a variety of levels wouldn't look like that. So I'm not talking about combat, but for a perfect example, let's say there's a US-China conflict. If I'm the Chinese, my objective would be to destroy Starlink. You like so that's combat of a sort. So I'd love you just to kind of like discourse on that.
Okay. Well, this could be a long answer, so jump in.
This is your platform. Go for it.
Okay, thanks. I'm a sci-fi fan as well, and it's a blank canvas on which to paint ideas. I love it, and there's all the philosophy is in sci-fi. We will get to a stage where you're going to get, the Starship Enterprise firing photon torpedoes or whatever, but that's just out there and so far away. It's just fun. If we're talking now, we already have the situation where last year the Russians knocked out some of the ground stations for the internet in Ukraine and left hundreds of thousands of people without access to the internet. In comes Starlink, Elon Musk and SpaceX. They fly in all these dishes for Starlink terminals. They get this part of, it was the Irpin region, part of Ukraine reconnected. So of course now everybody can either download Netflix or find out if your family's still alive. But of course the Ukrainian military jumped on it. Of course they did. And they used it to target Russian troops, which begs the question, does that make Starlink a legitimate military target? Now, the Russians didn't shoot the Starlink satellites out of the air, but they did dazzle them. They tried to dazzle them. They tried to spoof them with spoof packets.
What does dazzle? What does dazzle mean?
I beg your pardon. You shine essentially a laser from the Earth all the way up, right at the satellite, into its lens. If it's photographing. Now, most satellites, they can blink, if you like. If they get too much light, the shutter comes down. But that means they can't see anything while you're dazzling them. And you can spoof them is the technical term. You send up these packets of information. It confuses the satellite, and so it's not giving the proper information back down. So that's been going on for the last year and a half, basically between Elon Musk and Putin, which is a new era we are in. I mean, this has never happened before. So the Russians clearly do think of it in terms of it being a military target, but not going to the extent of trying to shoot it down, which they could, well, not theoretically. They have tested it, and so have the Americans. Both the Americans, Russians, Chinese, and Indians have all launched a ballistic missile from the surface of the Earth and knocked out one of their own satellites to test. And you mentioned China. Yeah, I believe if it ever did come to a fight for Taiwan, the first thing the Chinese are going to hit are the American surveillance satellites. But that's a bit down the line, and I don't think it's going to happen, but that's a bit down the line. So we're already there. Second bit, Musk then went on record this year and accepted it was true, this theory, this rumor, that the Ukrainians had followed up a few months later by doing underwater drone attack into Sebastopol's port to try and sink the Russian fleet there. But they, amazingly, hadn't realized that the Starlink signal didn't reach all the way to the port. And the missiles were already on their way. The drones were already on their way. And they rang up Musk at 3 o'clock in the morning. Said, Elon, could you switch it on, please? And he said no, because there's a quantum difference between enabling Ukrainian civilians to be back in touch with the 21st century and actually making a decision to enable a Ukrainian military attack on the Russian fleet. But again, it's a fantastic example of how we are where we are now in this new age without having gamed all this out and thought it all through, because this is 21st century warfare. Now, going on just a little bit ahead, as I said, we've already, when I say we in this context, Marshall, I mean humanity. It's often the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians, but we have been able to blow up satellites from Earth. The Americans have perfected a new laser weapon. It's got about a 4-kilometer range on Earth, and it can take down a drone because it beams the direct energy at the drone's computer chips, burns them out, drone falls. Fine. Imagine the temptation to put that on a satellite. Because then you haven't got a 4-kilometer range, because we're talking about space here. There's no atmosphere to go through, no clouds. The temptation to arm your satellites must be enormous. And at some point, one country might do it, in which case all countries will do it. You've got other things like dual-use satellites. They're now building satellites that have grappling arms, which can get hold of a satellite and throw it into the atmosphere in order to burn it up if it's past its use-by date, to get rid of space debris. That's fine. That's a good thing. But that's dual use, because you might be creeping up behind my satellite, which has got my early warning nuclear codes in it, and I'm getting very nervous at this point. So, warfare, at the moment, the space forces, including your own, are there to enhance the capabilities of the existing forces. I spoke with the head of UK Space Command, UK Space Force, and he was quite open, because this isn't really a secret. He says, yeah, we use it, our Space Force. We're watching our special forces. We can tell them, stop, the bad guys are over there. You don't want to go there. Or, no, hurry up, the bad guys are over there. This is used all the time, this stuff. And this link between our conventional forces, between the Navy, Air Force, Army, and then the space assets. But it's going to grow. And at some point in the future, the space forces will have their own offensive capabilities.
I'm curious in the deterrence theory here. So in the case of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons have not been used offensively since World War II, they are a deterrent. So you want your opponent to know you have a nuclear weapon. You test your nuclear missile, you test your delivery system, you actually test your process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can't deter if no one knows they have them in the first place. In the case of these satellite capabilities, let's say that laser that hypothetically could destroy it, is the incentive to keep that secret, or is that incentive to make that make everyone aware of that? Because the difference here, because the thing is with nukes are a great deterrent, because not only can you as a great power flex that you have them in order to deter your opponents, but they're just so difficult to build that it's not as if you set off a nuclear test and then the next year, oh no, like everyone in Asia has a nuke now. What were we thinking? It seems like the satellite capability of a laser would be much more scalable, even with like a medium range nation state. So I'd love to hear how you think about the theory here.
Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. I mean, one is that this tech is now being developed by several nations, and this is actually, I believe, the future of drone warfare. You will get the nano drones, which will swarm, and you can't be firing cruise missiles at them, or even $200,000 missiles. It's just not going to work, and it's expensive. This new laser that the Americans have perfected, it costs about $1 worth of electricity to fire it.
Wow!
Obviously, it costs X hundreds of millions to build it, but it's there now. But many countries are now rolling this out, and that's the future of drone warfare: swarming against mobile units which can fire direct energy weapons at the drones. The idea of whether you do or don't release the information and let your opponent know, it's a fascinating discussion. There's a real tension there. If you tell them, they might be deterred, but on the other hand, they might accelerate their own versions of it. If you don't tell them, you leave them nervous about what you might have, or you leave them thinking that you can't do this, and therefore they act. So, all that double bluff poker game is being played all the time. Do you remember the old song, The Green Door?
No.
What's Behind the Green Door? It's an old song, I think, from the early 60s. And it was a hit over here, but I think it was a cover of an American song. Sorry, the reason I bring this up, it's quite fun in a way, is the original Green Door was at a US Army base. And it was painted green, and it was ultra top secret. And behind it, there was loads and loads of secrets. And the song lyrics go something, I want to know what's behind the green door. And I just love that. And it's known sometimes in US Air Force parlance, That's a green door issue,
Mm.
and the green door debate is based on exactly what you said. Do you let your opponent know what you've got? Because there's pluses and minuses, and no one has ever really. There is no real right or wrong answer. On each bit of technology, you have to make your decision. Do you let them know, deter them? Do you not let them know and let them think they can get away with it? It's a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, and I think something I'm curious about, once again, we're dealing with the military theory side of things. I'm fascinated with the ability of satellites to take away like Clausewitzian concepts that have kind of undergirded warfare. So, for example, fog of war is just gone. Why was Putin unable to make the early case he basically wanted to make? In the sense of like the early war. It's like, hey, you had those guys out there with plasma in December 2021. It's hard to make a false flag type claim in that kind of situation. It's also impossible to imagine a world where the Chinese would be capable, let's say a Taiwan conflict was in the offing.
Yes.
That would take the greatest armada the world has ever seen. That's D-Day and the Sicily campaign on steroids.
That's right.
You could not do that secretly in a way you could have even like 50, 60 years ago. So how does this change the dynamic?
It does in the way you've just said. And in fact, I actually use that scenario in the new book, the China scenario, about the amount of buildup. I mean, we would see them coming from at least 3 months out, if they're really going to do an amphibious landing. They're going to have to assemble hundreds and hundreds of ships, and the satellites will see them from a very long time out. So that is new. And we're certainly a long way on. Just from 20 years ago, there was an example where Saddam Hussein in Iraq was able to move several thousand troops up north because he was trying to get at the Kurdish population. And the Americans missed it because somehow he knew when the satellites were above, because they're only over in like a 1 hour window. And he was getting everybody to go undercover camouflage when they knew it was above, and then they kept moving. And it was quite a surprise when they suddenly rocked up in the north. Those days are gone, partially because of geosynchronous orbit. Geosynchronous orbit, I think so alluded to it at the beginning. It goes around the Earth, this orbit, if you put a machine there, it travels around the Earth at exactly the same speed that the Earth is turning. So consequently, that satellite is over the same bit. If it's over your house now, it'll be over your house in half an hour, in 3 hours, in 6 hours, in 12. It's always over your house. It's always looking at that one piece of territory, which is very, very useful for all sorts of reasons. So, you can't really, and the cameras have got better, so you can't really hide. I don't know. You mentioned Clausewitz. I think some of the arguments that are made by the great war theorists are still hold, but technology does go past them sometimes, and the art of surprise. It's much more difficult. There is, though, there's still the problem of, hang on, you've announced these military exercises, you've gone on these military exercises, but you can still suddenly do a sharp right turn, and it's no longer a military exercise. And that, there is still the potential for surprise attacks. There's also, I mean, it's kind of getting off the subject of space in a way, but AI is going to throw up some extraordinarily interesting military challenges with false information, basically, that you think you're looking at something and you're not. But sorry, that's a bit of a distraction, I think, for this.
I would love to talk about the norms aspect of this. You reference this specifically at the start of the book by pointing out that there are these Cold War era treaties and norms and expectations. Just because you have space assets, just because America put our flag on the moon, doesn't mean it's now the 51st state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've pointed out that if those treaties ever truly were enforced, accepted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that almost certainly is not true now. Let's talk about this aspect of this dynamic.
Yeah, that's what I came out the back of the book realizing is probably the most important thing in the book. I didn't set out that way. The more I looked at it, the more I realized it's the case. We don't have the rules of the road. The rules of the road we have are for the 20th century. The rules of the road are mostly the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, some of which is really still good. But the 1967 Outer Space Treaty talks about no weapons of mass destruction in space. Fine, we won't put nuclear weapons on our satellites, but it doesn't say anything about lasers. So the tech has moved on, and the law is 50 years behind it. It says no one state can have sovereignty over any part of space, whether it's the moon, planets, or even an area of outer space. It doesn't say anything about corporations. Now you can extrapolate from it that it probably means them, but it's not written there and it's not ratified. So it doesn't say anything about how close your satellite can be to my satellite. So there's all this stuff literally floating around. And we don't have proper guidelines, and we don't have proper globally agreed legislation. We don't even have agreed legislation at a global level on how to clear up space debris, which, to my surprise, I learned that this is the biggest danger that the space experts believe there is to the Earth. It's not a war in space, it's space debris taking out all our satellites and crashing our economy. So I think, urgently need new rules of the road. Now, you probably, the Artemis Accords. This is led by the United States. It's a bilateral treaty with whoever wants to sign it, and about 29 countries have signed it: India, Israel, UK, France, lots of countries, Japan, UAE. So these 29 countries are going out into space with their rules of the road, with their guardrails, with their guidelines, and they've all signed up to them, and most of them are quite good. But China hasn't signed it. Russia hasn't signed it. And one of the rules is that if you spent all that money getting to the South Pole, and you now started to dig up the titanium, for example, or the lithium, the economic modeling for this is far from proven, but people are going to go and try. Well, you can declare a safety zone, say the 29 countries that have signed this. So what happens if another country that isn't in the Artemis Accords rocks up and lands and says, well, we're going to dig here as well? And you say, well, it says in the Artemis Accords, and they're going to say, and so what? What's that got to do with us? And as you know, China is actually banned from being part of the Artemis Accords. Congress has actually has forbidden NASA to cooperate. So China is going up with Russia as its junior partner and a handful of countries. The American-led bloc is going up, and this mirrors the politics of Earth. And of course, it makes it more dangerous because we should be going up as one species. We should be going up as the world. I mean, I know that's almost impossible to imagine, but it's why we need a global agreement on space debris and a global agreement for the 21st century on what can you do up there. Can you declare a safety zone? Could you even plant a flag and say, actually, this is the 51st state? What are the laws up there? We don't have them. We really, really need them.
It's interesting. I'm interested in the political theory here in the sense that we have a couple of different norms around treaties. So you could think of the 1920s Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlaws war. And obviously, it's kind of the history of the treaty is kind of complicated because on the one hand, obviously within a few years, you have the invasion of the Manchuria, you have the war in Ethiopia, you have the Spanish Civil War and World War II. So by some standards, the treaty didn't work. But the other standard is, well, what were the Nazis prosecuted at for Nuremberg? It was violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact because they set onto it. The point then is, after World War II, we have a lot of these norms that work, but those norms only came about after the cataclysm of World War II itself. So it seems that my takeaway would be, you're not naive to suggest you need treaties, you need joint efforts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I have a hard time imagining treaties or successful norms not coming out of disaster versus, hey, let's just preempt this problem that we actually see come about. I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that you said, but I would add to it, it doesn't have to come out of catastrophe, but it has to come out of a certain period of time. Now, you're right. Many of the things, the UN declaration, when the UN was set up, the Declaration of International Human Rights was born out of that catastrophe of World War II. And if there is something similar and space was involved, we will rewrite the laws to try to prevent it. But I think there is another scenario. At the moment, I believe we're in the Klondike gold rush of both weaponizing space and of colonizing it and trying to profit from it, digging on the moon, for example, which again, as I said, the economic modeling, very uncertain, but if it's the new oil, you ain't going to miss the chance to try it. So in the Klondike gold rush, you don't stop and say to the other guy trampling over the snow, we ought to sit down and talk about this. You just get there. And that's where we are now. We're just going to go hell for leather, all the different countries in different ways, in different blocks. But you know that after the United States got the nuclear weapon, and then the Soviets got the nuclear weapon a few years later, then they went hell for leather in building warheads, tens and tens and tens of thousands of warheads, until they realized, we need to talk about this. So I think it's quite probable that we'll go through the Klondike gold rush. Hopefully there will not be any, or at least little kinetic activity. And then eventually we'll realize just how important these assets are to us and just how disastrous it would be for the world economy if all the satellites went down, for example. Because if you take out enough satellites, we now have the capacity to do it, you're going to create, it's called the Kessler syndrome, where you basically got the world is encircled by a barrier of metal that you can't get through, and all that comms has now gone down, quite possibly causing a massive worldwide economic crisis. So when we go through this phase and then come out the other end of it and start to truly understand, and enough politicians are advised we need to, have treaties and discussions and guardrails, it'll happen. It'll happen because we'll know we have to do it. But, we only ever really take action when we have to do it.
So for the last section on the book, I'd love to ask about another difference between the Cold War and today, which is just, as we referenced previously, the private commercial actors. Yeah. Obviously, in the case of the United States, Elon Musk, but I've got Ashley Vance's most recent book out here too. Did an episode of him back in May. There's a bunch of other private actors that are entering the space as well. Yeah. In China, at least, pretty strong consensus that we should conceive of civil military fusion, meaning that we're going to treat a Chinese company the same operationally as the Chinese government. In the case of the United States, if you're not an American, you could always say, well, that's going to be true to a certain degree, which I think it's definitely true. Like SpaceX obviously works with NASA
to a certain degree. That's the.
However, Elon Musk is endorsing Ron DeSantis for president and telling people to vote Republican in the midterms in 2022. So the picture in the U.S. is actually quite complicated. So how should we because this is where the oceanic metaphor and the great history you do of space becomes really relevant. People read if there's a section people really need to read from the book. Your chapter just explaining basically from pre-Stonehenge all the way through the Cold War is just really great. So I really recommend that for people. But this is the Francis Drake equivalent. This is the 1500s. These are these private actors, these privateers that are. Well, how does this work?
Yeah, I've got another example I think I use in the book, and that's the East India Company. When the British colonialists went out there to rob everybody, basically, out ahead of the state was this private company, the East India Company. But eventually it became so powerful, it had its own militia. The war uniforms very similar to the British Army, redcoats. And it got so powerful that the British state thought, we better bring that into our fold, and basically incorporated it into the state.
Well, quick thing, it wasn't just that it was too powerful, it actually bungled something pretty big.
Yeah.
So because that's why that's why my point about what causes systemic change. It's very, very powerful. And then you have this whole massive rebellion across India because they bungle it. Yeah. So I think that's a relevant because that's what I imagine the SpaceX dynamic too, obviously.
Yeah, that is quite feasible. But I brought up the East India Company because I think that would also happen as and when if it became so economically viable that everybody was on the moon and it was incredibly important to the economy of a state, the state's not just going to let the companies be out there doing exactly what they want. The state will start to lean on them, start to legislate. For example, if you want to launch a rocket, you better have a license. I mean, Musk is not completely free to do whatever he wants. If you want to launch a plane from an airport, you better have a license. You want to launch a rocket, it's the same thing. So the state will, when these companies become front and center in the economies, if they come front and center, the state will lean in and try to gain control. Because I don't buy the argument, and I've not bought it, and I know it's 30 years old now, that corporations will take over from the state. I don't think they will, but we shall see. On the related subject and question that you also said about China. Now, yeah, of course, I think we agree. To an extent, the major American corporations such as Boeing have very strong links with NASA and with the US state. But it is not the same as China. Boeing can turn around to Washington and say, no. They have a lot of leeway because it's an open society. China, there really is very little gap between a commercial company. Essentially, I mean, if you're talking about a one-party state dictatorship where the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is the state and the state is the Communist Party, anything that operates within that framework is also part of the state and part of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party says yes or no. And so the Chinese space companies will not be operating out with, in any way, the state. And there is this massive, civil military fusion. That said, there are more than 100 significant startup space companies in China. And I am, it's obvious, at least one of them will be as big as SpaceX at some point. It's China. It's going to happen. So it'll be very interesting as we go through the century and we see major corporations in China rising to meet the innovation and successes of someone like SpaceX. That's going to be a really interesting thing. And then the relationship between those companies and the state. It's just, it sounds like it's new and almost sci-fi, but it's not. It's just like all the other things that have happened. It's just happening somewhere else now.
Something and by the way, I completely buy your frame of dismissing to a certain degree the, techno libertarian instinct that, corporations will supersede the state. But what makes this a little interesting with space, though, is, to your point, we should understand Earth as shoreline. And the international competition aspect that gets interesting here, and you've actually started to see this. There's a company I've interviewed the founder, Dalian Asparov, Varda Space, that they had some controversy with the Air Force about like re-entry in the US. So they actually just went to Australia. So it seems that what's different, the reason why Microsoft is still going to be subject to antitrust is like, okay, go for it. Like, where else you go? The US government could say, well, where else are you going to go? And especially in the year 2000, there's nowhere Microsoft could go. But when it comes to space regulation, especially given the southern hemisphere, the specific angles, I think there's definitely a world where like a developing country could offer alternatives to the SpaceXs of the world if there's controversy. What do you think about that dynamic?
I'll be honest with you. I was aware of it, but yes, you're right. It's worth focusing on it. I mean, it's not an exact comparison, but for example, China saw what America did after World War II, which is basically put bits of concrete all over the world because it really helps. The more concrete you've got all over the world, the more useful it is. And for example, they're building at the moment a bit of concrete in Djibouti on the Red Sea, a key strategic area, and they're building a naval base there because the world is now their oyster and they act globally. And I just mentioned that because it's the way of thinking about the world. And you're right, because of this technology, you can launch. If the Americans, for whatever reason, if the government fell out with SpaceX so badly, Musk can get up and move to French Guiana, and he can launch from there. Well, no, I assume he'd rather not, but he could launch from there. And there is a market, I would have thought, for countries that are near the equator, because as we said at the beginning, it helps to launch from as close to the equator as possible because you get more of a slingshot. Therefore, you need less fuel. Therefore, it's cheaper. Yes, come here and build your spaceport here. Invest here, and we won't be asking any questions. We won't be asking any difficult legal questions. Give us the money. So yes, it is that is new, and that is something you couldn't really have done in previous times.
But once again, the obvious government solution there, any potential geopolitical or state capacity power conflict between NASA, the US government, and SpaceX would be so intense that I think if companies tried to escape that conflict via just going down south, the sanctions on the company would probably be extreme.
Yeah.
Like the government would have means. So let's say, for example, like Elon Musk is just not willing to divest his relationship with China if things get hot. In this example, the solution wouldn't be, okay, SpaceX, we're just going to go to Guyana and there won't be any problems. Yeah. Obviously, the US government would create a bunch of problems. And by the way, put a bunch of pressure on the Guyanese
on French Guiana.
Yeah, to prevent that from happening in the first place. So
this
is obviously a limiting factor.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I think the state was, written up. It was wrong to write the state off at the turn of the century and say that its power would massively diminish. Because, my stock phrase was, if you're going to get burgled, you're not going to call Google. You're going to call the state. So, there is all sorts of ways and means. And in fact, going back to that example I gave of Elon Musk saying no to the Ukrainians on the second aspect, when if he had said yes, he could have helped sink the Russian fleet. His primary reason, he said, was that, he didn't want to, he didn't want to be the guy that actually helped one state attack another state's navy. But he also said, and I also believe that if I had done that, I would have fallen foul of various laws that the American state has, which would make it very difficult for him. But despite the things we both just said, I think your original point it still holds, that because of technology and because of global corporations, you can now have a much more of a 360-degree view of where you want to operate. And if you're finding it really hard in one area, you can move. But when it comes to the big power politics, and I hadn't thought of it in these terms. One of my things I always say is that I was taught it a long time ago by someone in one of our foreign affairs committees. He said, when you're looking at international relations, it's easy when you realize, okay, the Brits, they're with the Americans. That's not a problem. But he said it's useful to find out where most countries are balancing. How much weight are they putting on this foot or that foot? And you have to work out how much weight, which way they're leaning. And I've always thought in terms of this coming form of Cold War, as the years roll by, more and more countries will have more and more pressure on them to lean one way or the other, and most won't be strong enough to stay in the middle. But I hadn't really thought of it in terms of corporations. But of course, they will come under similar pressures.
It could add something to the discourse. Okay, so for the final question here, in the US at least, I don't know how the publishing works in the UK, all of your books are under what's called like the Politics of Place series. And I think these genuinely should be read together. You're looking at different aspects of geography. Obviously, in this case, though, we're entering the astropolitics sphere. But I just think I'm thinking of the questions I get from listeners. Geography as a whole, maps, redrawn borders, just seems to matter far more than it's always mattered. I think that's been the point of your books, but I think for just the average person interested in the world, it matters far more than they would have thought a few years ago. There's a way of just saying like, oh, we're living in the return of history. This is the period we're in. We'll go in one level deeper. Like this is really the return of geography. So I'd love you just to kind of close with almost like a pitch for your frame and the work that you do. Because I just think the work that you do is a really useful way of conceiving a really confusing decade and the challenges that are going to be raised by it.
I was very impressed with the term politics of places. One of the editors at Simon & Schuster, Scribner, came up with it. Because, yeah, it is the politics of place. To try to conceptualize it, everything that happens in international relations, of course, it happens within the framework of geography. I'm not a determinist. I don't believe it's the only thing that makes things happen. And there are geographical determinists. I'm not one of them. But it's this, you don't understand how geography underpins so much of what is happening. You're really missing a big part of the picture. And then some people can come back and say, yeah, but technology, gets rid of geography. And I answer back, no, it doesn't. It changes which bits of geography are important. And just as coal, where that coal was exceptionally important in the 19th century, and then it becomes less important in the 20th century, where the oil becomes more important. But that doesn't mean that geography is not important. It just means you shift your focus. Second example, the Himalayas have always restrained India and China, two great powers, from fighting a major land war. Now technology has allowed the Chinese to move to build a metalled and paved road right across the top of the world, in Tibet, all the way to the Indian border. But you're still dealing with geography, because you've still got to look at the distance for supply routes, altitude, because if they did fight, they would be fighting at a very, very high level. You have to factor that.
There are, those are the border clashes with like the spears and the fighting Israel.
So those are just two examples, and you can do it with every single incident you're looking at where geography is a factor. And if you haven't factored it in, you're not really seeing it. So, I'm a firm believer that this is true. You said it's kind of come back. You're right. I mean, it never went away, but it went out of fashion. Basically, what happened is the great geopolitical theorists like Alfred Mayer, the American, Howard Mackinder, the British guy who came up with the Heartland theory. Those theories in the early 20th century, some of them were seized upon by the Nazis and mistranslated and misused. Lebensraum, for example, living space that the Nazis came up with. And so after World War II, it became exceptionally unfashionable to believe there was such a thing as geopolitics. It was sort of conceived as being nationalistic, whereas it isn't. It's just a simple basic look at reality. And then I think what happened is, after that brief holiday from history at the end of the Cold War, and then after a few years, all those previous tensions began to bubble up again. I remember writing something about, the contours which had been hidden rose up again through the map. And then people realized, actually, we need to look at this. We need to factor this in. By the way, before we go, I should thank Everett Dolman. He's, I believe, the doyen of astropolitical thinkers. He's a US professor, teaches at one of your war colleges. And it was Professor Dolman that sort of talked me through the geography of space and how understanding the geography of space would help me understand decisions that were being made. And as soon as he explained it to me, it was so apparent, because it's exactly the way I look at the world. But this guy sort of encouraged me to look at space in a similar way. I'm convinced of it. I'm not a determinist. I don't argue it's the only thing. I just think it's the thing that too often people miss.
That is an excellent place to end. Tim, this has been really great. Always great to have you on the show. If you have a sixth book in the series, would love to welcome you back. But now that we've literally left the atmosphere, I think you've reached the limits of the metaphor, and we're a little too far away from the universal theory of politics. So
beyond my brain power.
Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Marshall. It's really, honestly, I can't tell you. You challenge me, because you see these concepts and then ask me to articulate them. It's a challenge, but thank you for the challenge.
Thank you.